In our study of using the quadratic formula, we learned that it is one of four methods that we can use to solve quadratic equation. Some of the other methods are factoring. We could also use the radical property. We could also use completing the square. And we determined that if we use the quadratic formula, it would give us our solution. And sometimes when we look at our solutions, they're rather simple. Like for this equation, the solution is a simple solution. However, we've seen in our previous example that our solution may not be a simple solution, but it may be composed of a rational and an irrational number, as we've seen here. There are times when we use the quadratic formula where we may end up in a situation where we have a negative underneath the radical. And this particular discussion, we're going to learn how to deal with that situation when we have a negative underneath the radical. When we have that type of situation, we're getting into what's called the imaginary number system. And we're going to look at how we handle those type of solutions, and how we handle solutions that almost look like this, complex solutions. So we're going